The Politics of Culture, Understanding Local Political Resistance to Detracking in Racially Mixed Schools. The article is by Amy Stewart Wells and Irene Serna. The presentation is by Meredith Westbrook. I am Stephen Westbrook. A couple of questions to think about as you're watching this. One, is it worth it to have a gifted program if the program isn't totally equitable to all races, classes, genders, religions? Two, is an advanced class, an honors class, a gifted class, the same thing as tracking? Three, is the IB program or the International Baccalaureate program or any tracked program racist or classist? Four, which of your own children would you like to sacrifice so that someone else can get their spot in an advanced class? Now, obviously, that last question is tongue-in-cheek. We're not doing a Genesis-level binding of Isaac, sacrificing of our kids, but in a finite system where there are a finite number of spots in a gifted program, which one of your kids, given that you're a stakeholder in the system, would you be willing to leave out if you were a parent, if you were an aunt or an uncle? All right, let's outline the article. This study was published back in 1996. The study was actually begun in 1992 by my math, and I'm not a math teacher. That makes it anywhere from 22 to 26 years old, which is a long time in educational policy and educational research. This study predates Race to the Top. This study predates No Child Left Behind. That means if we're going to look at the worldview behind this study, we have to undo two focal lenses of looking at education to get at what Wells and Serna were studying. Wells and Serna looked at 10 racially and socially economically mixed schools from around the country that were undergoing detracking reform. These were schools that were trying to get rid of the tracking programs they had in place. The study attempts to capture the essence of the political strategies that blocked the detracking. The study looks at who was trying to keep tracking in place, who did not want to detrack. The study talks a lot about the local elites. The local elites wanted to block detracking. These are people who had a combination of economic, political, and cultural capital, and the community really valued them for a myriad of reasons. Therefore, their children were the ones that tended to rise to the top. Their children enjoyed a privileged status in that tracking system, which is why, of course, the parents wanted to keep tracking in place. Wells and Serna defined detracking as the process of moving schools towards a less rigid system of assigning students to classes and academic programs. 1996 was a long time ago, and I was kind of young back then, but I get the sense that the term detracking may have changed, if not in definition, certainly in connotation, since then. But for the purposes of this article, detracking, the process of moving schools towards a less rigid system of assigning students to classes. We learn in the article that almost all 10 of the racially mixed secondary schools, and it's important that we're talking about secondary schools, not elementary, just middle and high school, tracking was a form of resegregation. Tracking was a way of keeping the white kids at the upper track and the not white kids on the not so upper track. I say almost all of the 10 schools. One of the 10 schools was in a very urban environment, and it turned out that race was less of a factor there. Not zero factor, but less of a factor in that one school. Okay, so who are these local elites? Uniformly, they are upper middle class, completely the upper economic crust of their communities. They are influential in the community in their jobs, in their positions, in their churches or religious institutions. They are those who, quote, their way of knowing is equated with intelligence, which is another way of saying that the way they viewed the world was the culturally dominant way of viewing and understanding the world. And if you think that they imparted that way of understanding their world to their children inherently came with a leg up. They tended to be members of academia or of corporate America. In one of the schools that Wells and Serna looked at was a college town, and the local elites were university professors. Another school they looked at was kind of a corporate town, and these were all the white collar managers of corporate America. The local elites were usually white, almost always white. The hierarchy tended to go rich white is greater than poor and white, which is about equivalent to rich and a person of color, which is greater than non-rich and a person of color. There were basically four ways that Wells and Serna talked about how the local elites fought detracking, how they undermined detracking. One, and the most common one, was threatening flight. These were families who could conceivably have afforded to send their children to private school, and dangling that threat of removing their kids from the system and thus removing themselves from the system and thus removing their prestige from the system and thus taking the political clout that the school had by having the local elites as part of the school and taking that political clout to the local private school. That was the most common threat. The way that the local elites undermined the system the most often. Something to the effect of, you could take the gifted track away, but then Westminster would look really nice to us. I don't know. And of course, that would work. Two, co-opting the institutional elites. The institutional elites are different than the local elites. The local elites tended to not be part of, formally, professionally, part of the educational system. But the institutional elites, they are. They're the school board members. They're the superintendent. Some of the principals in the schools. Not the teachers in the classroom, understand, but the people who are running the school system. And by getting them on your side and if you convince the school board that tracking is a good idea, that's half the battle right there. Three, a buy-in from the, quote, not quite elite. Wells and Serna found that the people who were, the parents who were boots on the ground at the school tended to not be the local elites. They tended to be a second tier of parents, read PTA. But the local elites would co-opt them to their agenda as well. So it, paraphrased, the PTA is toothless, but let's get them on our side anyway. Four, accepting detracking bribes. You could also qualify this as reterming detracking, or detracking for most people, but not my kids. This would be the strategy of allowing the letter of the law to change so that the school does not, or the system does not look like it's tracking anymore, but keeping a track just for certain students, or keeping all of the best teachers in the school with one team of students, so that for all intents and purposes, there was still a track just for the local elites kids. This was an interesting article for us to read because while there were several really good points that Wells and Serna brought up, there were also a lot of points that Meredith and I found against their argument. So we wanted to address both of those. This picture here is from a video that I will link to from the Baltimore Sun. I don't have time to play it in this presentation, but I strongly suggest watching it, about interviews with several students, none from this particular study, but all of whom were in a similar situation where they found themselves tracked out of the best classes and how they dealt with that, knowing that they had been held back, especially once they broke into the AP classes. Wells and Serna accommodate for the classism inherent in society. We live in a broken society where isms, classism, racism, sexism, still exist. And Wells and Serna's argument to detrack accounts for the evil in all of us, I suppose. The National Excellence Report, which is on our class ELC webpage, says that schools must eliminate barriers to participation of economically disadvantaged and minority students, which ties in very well with Wells and Serna's argument. An interview with Wells, also posted on the ELC page, she talks about how diversity in the classroom promotes tolerance, acceptance, and preparedness for the future. And finally, maybe the biggest argument for Wells and Serna's implied point is that being placed incorrectly on a low track has long-lasting and negative impacts on students. These are all good arguments for Wells and Serna's article. Arguments against. Gifted education is good. Detracking means for Wells and Serna, means getting rid of gifted education. And I believe we are all in this program because we believe in the value of gifted education. Homogeneous ability grouping leads to higher achievement. There are a myriad of studies out there that demonstrate with empirical evidence that gifted students perform better when they are placed with other gifted students who can challenge them, that the teachers can go more in depth, can move more quickly with all the class being on the same page, and this helps the gifted students. The National Excellence Report also says, in a large national survey, most teachers said they gave the same assignments to both gifted and average students almost all the time, and few said they used many higher level teaching strategies in their classroom. This gainsays a point in Wells and Serna's article where they said, quote, for example, if a school does away with separate classes for students labeled, quote, gifted, but teachers continue to challenge these students with the same curriculum in a D-track setting, the only losses the students will incur are their labels and their separate and unequal status. That's nice and pie in the sky, but the National Excellence Report says that doesn't actually happen. Not all regular education teachers are gifted certified, and if we believe in teaching gifted students the way they are, biologically programmed to learn, not all regular education teachers can handle this group of students. Maybe most importantly, tracking does not equal homogeneous ability grouping, and this is how the definition may have changed or modified in the past 20 years. A student can take AP Physics, but take low-level language arts. Think a ELL student. Being on a ability group in one class does not mean that you're that way in all of your classes or for all of middle school and high school. Wells and Serna say that one of their concerns from elite parents of detracking is that their children will not be served well in detracked classes. But the authors suggest that perhaps what they're more worried about is losing status or power. What the parents, are more worried about is losing status or power. Quote, for example, if a school does away with separate classes for students labeled as gifted, but teachers continue to challenge these students with the same curriculum in a D-track setting, the only, quote, losses the students will incur are their label and their separate and unequal status. Which brings us to our discussion questions. I want you to answer either question 1 or question 2. They kind of get at the same thing. Question 1. Assuming, as Wells and Serna do, that there is some inherent classism built into them because of social realities, is it still worth it to have a gifted program? Should we still have a gifted program if it is going to be inherently unequal because of the society we live in? A similar question you could choose to answer: are track programs like International Baccalaureate racist or classist? Talk to me about that. Looking at society, I would like you to answer either question 3 or 4. Based on the last slide that we just looked at, would taking kids out of gifted classes cost them more than just the label of being gifted? And 4, do you feel like your school or school system has been hijacked by the, quote, elite parents in your community? We look forward to reading your responses and seeing what you think on the subject. Have a wonderful day.